Hey there, welcome to episode 73 of the Social Business Engine podcast. This is the podcast where I invite people from brands around the world who are willing, well, not just willing, but excited to share with you how they use social media in their business strategy. I'm Bernie Borges, CEO of Find and Convert, and your host of the Social Business Engine podcast. Now, on this episode, you're going to meet two humans and a dog. Well, first, I'm going to tell you about the humans. Natalie Barnard is the social media manager at Frog's Leap Winery in Rutherford, California. Natalie is joined by Jonah Beer, the general manager at Frog's Leap Winery. I'm going to keep you in a little bit of suspense and let Natalie and Jonah tell you about the dog in this social business story. You're going to hear how Frog's Leap Winery has developed brand loyalty one person at a time dating back to 1981, and how they've integrated digital communications into their brand loyalty strategy. But before I get to my interview with the two humans and a dog from Frog's Leap Winery, I want you to know that this episode is sponsored by my friends at Cision, a leading global media intelligence company. Soon we're going to be publishing the next issue of Social Business Journal, which features 5 enterprise-level brands who answer the question, what's working in social media marketing? Now, if you're subscribed to receive our weekly podcast through email, you'll get notified when we publish this journal, but you must be subscribed by email. So if you're not subscribed to get our weekly updates, which we email every Friday morning with each podcast episode, then you can get subscribed by texting 38470 and enter SBE show as the text message. Again, that's 38470 and enter SBE show, and it's not case sensitive. And then you'll get subscribed so that we can notify you when the new journal issue gets released. Now, of course, if you are currently at your desktop or equivalent, you can just as easily subscribe by hitting our subscribe page at socialbusinessengine.com. And now let's get to my interview with the human equation from Frog's Leap Winery with Natalie Barnard and Jonah Beer. Natalie and Jonah, welcome to the Social Business Engine podcast.
Thank you.
Bernie.
Hi, Bernie.
It's great to be here.
Outstanding. Well, let's begin with an overview of Frog's Leap Winery, because I've done my homework and I know about your history, and it's a really interesting history. But let's share that with our listeners. Why don't we start there?
Well, Bernie, it's a great story because it's an unlikely story. The wine business here in the Napa Valley stretches back to the late 1800s, but really had its renaissance serendipitously with a vintage of Cabernet Sauvignon that was 1973. So being podcast 73, we're on the right one. There's no doubt about it.
Oh, that was fortuitous.
Yeah, the 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon from a winery called Stag's Leap Wine Cellars won this big international tasting in 1976 called the Judgment of Paris, where it really stood out as being as good, and in this case better, than the best of the French wines of Bordeaux. Well, that alerted a lot of people to the fact that Napa Valley here in California could make world-class wines. Well, the guy who was a part of making that wine was John Williams. He was the first employee at Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, and he is the founder, owner, and winemaker here at Frog's Leap. Mm-hmm. You can kind of see where the leap half of our name comes from.
Right.
Yeah. John has seen really the valley change over the years. So 1973, when there was just a handful of wineries in the Napa Valley, to what we have today, where there are some 500 wineries here in Napa, and quality Cabernet Sauvignon ground sells for $500,000 an acre. But back then in 1981, when John decided he wanted to launch his own winery and not just work for other people, he didn't have the kind of money it took to start a winery. He was almost the opposite situation. Today we see people start wineries in Napa, and these are wealthy people that own the color blue. It's wealthy individuals. And John was a kid from upstate New York who grew up on a dairy farm, had been working in the Napa Valley as a winemaker, had scraped together about $10,000 by selling his motorcycle, borrowing from friends, borrowing from family, and with $10,000, he had the chance to start a small little winery to make one wine,
Hmm.
Sauvignon Blanc, in 1981. And he put all his eggs in that one basket. He needed to buy the grapes, make the wine, and start selling it within 6 months because he needed the cash from the sales for the next year's crop.
Hmm.
So it really was this amazing story of someone that just decided to strike out on their own and give it a shot. And what he discovered early on was, you put down your friends for like, oh, well, Bob will buy 6 cases and Tom will
Mm-hmm.
buy 5 cases. And then you go to Bob and Tom and they'll take one bottle. you know, they'll each take 6 bottles, and oh my gosh, it really alerted John very quickly that he had to get out and start selling his wine and
He
start
had to build
introducing
the
it to people.
brand. He had to build the
Had to
brand.
build a brand.
Yeah, and I wonder if it even occurred to him when he was going through that early founding process, because he was so passionate about the process of winemaking. Sometimes founders don't think about the marketing side.
It's funny. It did catch him off guard a little bit, and he knew he's kind of one of those great entrepreneurs that sees the whole picture. But certainly his passion lies in winemaking and grape growing.
Mm-hmm.
So when it did come time to go out and sell wine and build a brand and do the things it took, yeah, it was a bit of a, oh my gosh, this is going to be harder than I thought, and it's going to require just a lot of blocking and tackling, the basics of getting out, introducing who you are and who your brand is to as many people as you can.
So in the earlier days, pre-digital, pre-internet, the modern way of doing digital communications, and of course we're going to get to that. What are some of the blocking and tackling, some of the basic fundamentals of building the Frog's Leap Winery brand?
It was and is a slow process, and Natalie really is really kind of likes to tease me a lot about how slow things work in the wine business. We do things annually. We have long cycles. It's like when you plant a vineyard to when you pick grapes, it's 7 years. That's a very different world than digital, technology, software, social media, and all of these things. So we kind of have this odd way of, since we've built this brand since day one, it's been slow. And it's been one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so John started with concentric circles. He wanted to be known by every restaurant in the Napa Valley. And he wanted every chef and restaurateur to know his brand, know the wine, and have it on their list.
Okay.
And then he would expand out to San Francisco and to Sacramento and then out of California. And then we had this fortuitous moment on the East Coast where a wine writer in New York wrote about Frog Sleep. And then all of a sudden it was, okay, now there's restaurants in New York that want to know about our wine. So off he flies to New York to meet with them one-on-one, pull the cork out of the bottle and pour it to a sommelier or a chef or a restaurant owner and say, hey, this is my wine. This is what I've done to create it and to grow these grapes, and this is why I love it. So it's word of mouth, one-on-one, tasting the product and telling the story.
Okay. So fast forward to the modern age, fast forward to about the last year, give or take. Word of mouth is still very important, but you've embraced the digital world. You've embraced social media. So let's start talking about, how would you characterize your strategy as it relates to digital and social media?
Well, I'm going to give just a little background, then let Natalie answer that question more specifically, because I think it's important to understand how we even got to understanding what social media was. And it was really me putting together a Facebook page for Frog Sleep and treating it like it was my personal, not telling personal things, but I would think about it as if, hey, this is cute. Maybe people on the Frog Sleep page would like to see where the grapes are at today or how the season's going. And so it was really haphazard and poorly done, and yet it still had some traction. And what we realized was that Facebook and certainly other platforms that have arisen since then, Instagram, for instance, have shown us that these can be great extensions of us not changing our story, not telling a new story, not creating a new strategy, but just a new way of telling the story that we've been telling and what we've found to be intriguing and compelling for our guests and customers and friends alike over the last 30 years. So we started trying to use the platforms to engage people.
Mm-hmm.
And once we saw that my horrible approach at understanding what photos worked and timing, and I said, we need to get someone in here that actually understands the space and understands the vocabulary and knows how to pull the levers to make the machine work. And that's when we found Natalie, and it was a godsend because, like, within 3 days, I realized how out of my depth I had been, and really, like, just what a disservice I had been doing to something that could and should be a better way for us to tell our story. So that's when Natalie came on just over a year ago.
Okay. All right. So, Natalie, how's it going? Why don't you talk a little bit about what you've been doing to continue the word of mouth and brand loyalty focus for Frog's Leap Winery?
Yeah, well, it's an honor to work for them. They just were really looking to invest in a new communication tool. And as you've heard, they have a very rich and complex story. And it's been a challenge to translate it to the world of social. But it's been really enjoyable because their goal isn't to drive more traffic and simply get more clicks. Their goal for me is to provide value to their followers and deepen the connection and build a community. And so my goals are focused on brand and community management. And it's been really fun for that reason.
Okay, now you said something that really resonates with me, and that's, deepen the connection with your followers, with your community. In my world, in the podcasting world, I use the word audience because that's one of the things that I strive to do is to deepen my connection with my audience. So I really, really get that, and it really means a lot to me. So you want to elaborate on some of the things that you're doing in the digital communications world to deepen that connection with your followers and your loyal customers?
I think the ways that we've been able to deepen it, we really had to start by listening. And we've used a few social listening tools to figure out who our advocates are and the content that they want to know more about and the platforms that they're spending time on and when they can be reached and how our content is being perceived. So before we could start talking about Frog's Leap, we needed to figure out what people were saying and what they were responding to. We would communicate with them just like we would a friend. And so we just needed to figure out the time and the place that was good for them. And so that started by tracking different information when they're online and what's trending in the community and what they want to learn more about.
Okay, so you started listening and you started to learn some trends, and again, when they're online, the kind of topics that interest them, and did that influence how you engage? Did that influence the kind of content that you would either produce or share?
Yeah, Bernie, what we've learned, and one of the great things that Natalie taught me is to understand the importance of engagement. And we have this very layered, very detailed, complex story. So when we started to see and listen to, well, what really is resonating with our community and what are they talking about outside of us? We didn't change who we are or what our story is, but we said, well, what part of our story do they want to hear more about? And so, yeah, we started producing and talking about things that mattered more as we saw engagement rates go up and stay high, such as what's going on in the garden, what's happening in the season, what's happening with the grapes today. People, we discovered, wanted to be a part of the ongoing process of grape growing and winemaking. And one of the things that really kind of blew us away and taught me a good lesson that Natalie pointed out was that we can't just talk about what we think is important. We need to use engagement as a way and comments back as a way to help us better articulate our message and to not always be too serious. And one of her examples was we posted a picture of the dog playing with a pumpkin, and it got like 10 billion likes and engagement all over the place and shared by everybody. And then we posted a piece that John wrote about the importance of veraison in Cabernet Sauvignon, and it got like 3 people to like it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we realized that we can't just produce and talk about the things we want to. If you're not listening and you're not taking the feedback to adjust what your audience wants to hear, then you're doing them a disservice and your brand as well.
Well, as I peruse through your digital channels, and I characterize it that way intentionally because I'm including your website. You have a gorgeous website, and of course that will get linked up in our show notes. We'll probably grab. It's going to be hard to grab just one or two compelling images because you have so many, but we'll grab one or two and screenshot it and put it in the show notes. But when I peruse your website, as well as your social media channels, most notably Facebook and Instagram, the richness of the pictures, and yes, that employee by the name of Abbie, and I'm calling her an employee, your dog, the Winery Dog, Abbie, she steals the show.
She does.
She really does. I mean, who doesn't love a dog? And she's gorgeous and she's playful, and you can see that she is part of the family.
Yeah. Yeah, she is. And it's so funny because it was actually through our understanding and interaction with our fans and followers on social media that we realized how important Abbie was to their visits to the winery. They would leave the winery and go back to St. Louis or Tampa or where not and say, hey, how's the dog? That's what they would email us with a question about. So we decided when we rebuilt our website a couple years ago, we need to include something on the dog. So the first idea was we were going to strap a GoPro to her head and just let her run around. But when you do that, it is nauseating to watch the video afterwards. So we actually found.
So you tried it? You really tried it?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it was awful.
And it stayed on her head?
Grass. Yeah, no, not really. It was grass and then falling and then like fell to the side. Then it was fur and bouncing, and it didn't work at all. So we found
this. You could use it as blooper B-roll.
It is a great blooper reel. It will play over the credits, you know. But then we found this great director who does documentaries, and he said, what if we just really shot this as a day in the life of a winery dog, which quite honestly has the life we all want to come back as. If you can come back as anything in life number 2, choose a winery dog. It's fantastic.
Yeah, well, I second that. Let's talk about something that you're doing that's very interesting, and that's the Fellowship of the Frog. First of all, I love the name, so why don't you describe what it is and the strategy behind it?
We saw years ago, and it's only 6 years old, which is very, very young and new relative to the amount of time that wineries here in the Napa Valley have had what they call wine clubs, which is basically a quarterly shipment of a selection of wines to your home. And so it's like a subscription. You're going to get 2, 3, 4 bottles of wine every quarter with some stories about the wine, interesting tidbits about what they are they special, they're unique, first access to new wines, etc. And it was a thing, but it was a subscription to a wine delivery service. And when we started to really better engage with our customers and our friends, and we call them now Frog Fellows, we realized that we didn't just want to build a wine club that was a subscription service. We wanted to create a fellowship built around the history of frog sleep, the legacy of the wines, the love of a winery dog and a small garden in Rutherford, and say, hey, join us in this community. Join us at the table. We saved you a seat. Here, sit next to us while we share wine together. And it's been it just grew like crazy. To the point it's almost maxed out now. We really don't think we can allow it to get much bigger because we've got this just rabid base of people that love what we do and they want to be a part of a community. And then it's been amazing to see how Natalie's been able to take that and help turn it into better digital content for like the newsletter that we send out to our Frog Fellows so they can get some insider scoop and behind the scenes pictures and information on bits of winery details that maybe you wouldn't know unless you were on the inside of the community. So it's just been another great way to connect, to develop that kind of deep brand attachment that we think is so important to what got us here. Helped us survive over 35 years when we had no money and no advertising and no budget, to still not having any advertising, no money and no budget. But we think that we can last another 35 years or more.
So earlier, Jonah, you talked about how John Williams started the winery 35 years ago with very little money, and today someone who starts a winery is someone who's very wealthy and someone who may be thinking about buying a winery or a basketball team.
Right. It's one of those two.
Because the price point is probably pretty similar.
It's close.
So how do you compete in the modern age? Back in the early days, it was about the word of mouth and relationship building and going to the restaurants. But in the modern age, where there's many, many more wineries than there were 35 years ago when John Williams started Frog's Leap, how are you competing in the modern age, and what role does your social strategy play in that strategy?
That's a great question, and one that is the one thing that kind of keeps wakes me up in the middle of the night every now and then is how are we gonna how's little old Frog's Leap, which hasn't grown in size in 20 years, which farms its own grapes and makes wines in the way that's important to us. How are we going to compete as people get smarter, with more resources, with more ability to dominate the marketplace? And it's funny how every year we keep coming back to our success hinges on one simple thing: being authentic,
Mm-hmm.
being genuine. Because at the end of the day, people can sniff out BS marketing, storytelling that's barely skin deep and there's nothing behind it,
Mm-hmm.
storytelling that's inauthentic or shifts with the trends and the tides. And oh, you like Malbec? We'll make Malbec. Oh, you like buttery Chardonnay? We'll make buttery Chardonnay. Oh, you don't like buttery Chardonnay anymore? We won't make it anymore. Like that stuff just destroys brand equity, in my opinion. And so we've really focused on being just remaining true to who we are and
Mm-hmm.
being sincere and humble and genuine in our communication. Natalie's taken that and translated it into, and one of the things she helped us adjust to was, you don't have to post just for the sake of posting. Make a post or something you're putting out there rich content, or at least points towards rich content. And then throw in your occasional dog playing with a pumpkin and fun things that have a little bit of levity to them.
Mm-hmm.
But make sure that your posts have some value and genuine. You're offering something of genuine value to the reader, to the listener, to the person that's looking at your picture. And so that's kind of that dominates, I think, everything we do. Natalie, wouldn't you agree?
I would, yes. Our goal is to bring that in-person experience, that high-touch experience that you would have at our winery, and do the same thing online. You want to be warm and personal, genuine, and customer-focused.
One part of your story that I also enjoy is the Red Barn. You want to share with my listeners, what is the Red Barn and how does that fit into your story?
It's a great iconic building here in the Napa Valley that was built in the late 1800s by a vintner named Christian Adamson. We think that the Napa Valley began, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, in 1976 with the Judgment of Paris, but there were a lot of farmers working really hard to grow grapes and make world-class wine pre-Prohibition. And Christian Adamson was one of those guys, and he had a beautiful 1,000-acre vineyard here on the property. He had actually a couple old red barns and was making great wine in there until Prohibition put him out of business. And then the barn fell into disrepair, and then the bank foreclosed on the property, and then it almost fell over. The other barn burned down. The property was a mess. So when John saw it in 1994, he said, "Man, that's perfect for Frog's Leap because it's got to be cheap." And we borrowed a little bit of cash and bought that barn, and then went through the painstaking process of rebuilding it, of reconstructing it with its original materials, bringing it back to the place where it could make wine the way it did in 1894. And it was funny, we had our first crush in there. Our first harvest back in the barn making wine was harvest of 1994. And it was 100 years since Christian Adamson had been making wine in that barn. And that was a pretty impressive and a humbling moment, because it reminds you that, as smart as we all think we are and we think we've got stuff figured out, Christian Adamson thought he did too back in the 1800s. And the world shifts around you. You got to stay focused on who you are as a company and what your promise is to your customers, but yet don't be afraid of embracing Instagram and Facebook and new digital media as it comes around. Find a way to use it to tell your genuine story, and you'll be okay. And that's the barn's a great reminder that we don't really have anything figured out.
Well, I don't know that I would agree with your last comment because I think you've got it figured out, Jonah. What you've figured out is that the story that made you successful in your early years is your story, and you're sticking to it, and you should stick to it. And that is what's going to sustain your success, staying true to that story. And Natalie, as you said, sharing that story in an authentic way. And Jonah, as you said, not responding to everybody on social media saying, oh, yeah, we'll make this wine or that wine. And Natalie, you also shared with me, I think it was before we started recording, that you actually don't post as frequently as other brands do. And when I say other brands, I don't necessarily mean within the wine industry. You post, and Jonah, I think you were the one who referenced this, you post when you've got something relevant to post. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to talk for the sake of talking, and we do want to make sure that everything that we're sharing on social media has some value and, something important to say that will deepen our audience connection to our brand.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So, Jonah, you guys have it figured out.
Well, you're sweet to say so.
I'm here to tell you.
Maybe I'll sleep better tonight.
Well, I know that I've accomplished one big goal that I had for this podcast episode, and that is to paint this very visual picture for my listeners, many of whom are mobile when they're listening to a podcast, to paint that visual picture of your winery, the Red Barn, Abbie the dog, the Winery Dog, and how you as a brand are authentically connecting with your audience. So I think we have accomplished that, and I'd like to segue now to my one thing question. And Jonah and Natalie, this is where I ask you if there's any one thing that you could change about the way that business is conducted today, what would that be? And feel free, both of you, to answer, or one of you, however you'd like to respond.
I think my one thing would be that there's just not one way to do business or social media for that matter. And that's something that I've learned coming to Frog's Leap is they have a different way of doing things, very genuine way, a very warm, customer-focused way. So how we measure our success is a little bit different from other people, and how another company might measure their success on social media would be dependent on their goals and what they're trying to achieve. We're always striving to provide a warm, genuine experience to our consumers, and we're hoping to build a lifelong brand attachment to them. So that's why engagement and being able to tell rich, complex stories is really important to us, and sharing that with our audience on social media.
Outstanding. Well said.
Very well said. I will revert back to the very first corporate bylaw written at Frog's Leap in 1981 by John and his partner at the time, a guy named Larry. They said, any decision made while sober must be reviewed later over a bottle of wine. And I think that if every business could live by that corporate charter, we would be in a good spot. We'd be in a good spot.
So now I know how you make all your decisions at Frog's Leap Winery.
4:30 p.m. on a Friday is decision-making time.
And the later into the evening, the more decisions you make.
That's true. That is true.
Well, that is terrific. Well, Natalie Barnard and Jonah Beer from Frog's Leap Winery, thank you so much for coming on the Social Business Engine podcast, sharing your story with us here today. Of course, we will have, in our show notes page, we'll have a link to as many things as we can link to that we discussed here today. And of course, that will include a picture of the Red Barn and Abbie, the Winery Dog, among other things. So again, thank you for joining us here today to share your story with my listeners.
Thank you very much, Bernie. It was a lot of fun.
Terrific. Well, I want to remind everyone that this episode is sponsored by my friends at Cision, a leading global media intelligence company, and we're about to publish a new social business journal that's going to feature 5 enterprise-level brands answering the question, what's working in social media marketing? So the way to get that is make sure that you are subscribed to our weekly podcast by email. And just as a reminder, the way to get subscribed, unless you're at your website now, or at our website rather, where you can just hit our subscribe page, you can text, and that's just texting 38470, and enter SBE Show as the text message. Again, 38470 and enter SBE Show as the text message, and it is not case sensitive. If you are a regular listener to the Social Business Engine podcast, have you written a review on either iTunes or Stitcher? If not, would you take a minute to write a review? That increases the chance of other people discovering this podcast. And then when you do that, let me know so that I can reach out to you and express my sincere thanks to you, because I really appreciate that. In fact, I always enjoy hearing from my listeners. Some people tweet me up at Bernie Borges or SB Engine. Some people reply to me in the weekly email updates that go out every Friday morning, because it does come from me. And some people connect with me on LinkedIn. But if you send me a LinkedIn invitation, please personalize it and tell me that you've listened to my podcast. Of course, remember to visit our show notes page at socialbusinessengine.com/podcast to get links to everything we discuss here today. That is going to do it for this episode. But first, hey, if you have a social business story that you want to share on this podcast, reach out to me through the contact page at socialbusinessengine.com or tweet me at Bernie Borges. So until next time, this is your host, Bernie Borges of Find and Convert, wishing you continued success on that journey of yours on your path to social business success.